In this video, we're going to be going over the user interface and how to make it look nice, readable, easy to follow, and most importantly, stable. The funny thing about buttons is that when you first create them, they can be kind of hard to work with, so I'll give you some tips and tricks on how to make that easier, as well as how to make sure that they stay the same shape and size over time as users interact with your workbook. There are some common pitfalls that developers fall into when making their first macros, and I'm going to help you avoid that. Alright, so we're starting out here with a blank workbook, and we're going to immediately just go down and rename the sheet. If you want, you can just start out with a workbook and follow along, or you can go to that'sobasic.com and go to the Intro to VBA tab and download the companion file that goes with this video. I always like to start out by calling the tab where I'm going to put my buttons controls. I kind of think of this as a central place that people go back to whenever they're trying to run my macro or figure out what the next step in a process is. Then I would go to the Developer tab, go down to Insert, and then in the upper left-hand corner, there's a button form control. There's lots of other options here of things that you could insert into your sheet, but we're just going to start out with buttons for this particular video. Go ahead and just draw a button by placing your mouse onto the page, and then you're going to click and drag like I just did. You have immediately the option to assign the button to an existing macro, which I don't actually have any macros in my workbook, but if I did, I could just immediately do the assignment. I don't ever actually do it this way. I tend to create the buttons before I've even written a macro. It's really up to you. Find a groove that works best for you. So click OK. And then I immediately right-click on the button and I go to Format Control. You're going to want to go to Properties. Again, if you have an older version of Excel, your menus might look a little bit different, in which case the properties would be over here. But then you have Object Positioning Options. This is the biggest issue I've seen with macros, is that if I don't change the setting, it by default says Move and Size with Cells. I'm going to go ahead and leave this setting on to show you what this means. So if I was to drag this column to be bigger, my button automatically becomes bigger. And the same thing if I was to drag the column to be smaller, and oops, now you can't even read the button. I'm just going to click Control-Z a couple times to get it back to where it was. So now right-click on the button, and then you have two options here that are more appropriate. One is to move but don't size with the cells, or don't move and don't size. If I click Move but don't size, then I could say Insert a column here, and the button will move over, but it won't change shape. So nothing happens if I was to just drag this column to be bigger. And if I was to right-click here, and then, let's go and to the Format Control and go over this last option of Don't Move or Size. This is usually the option that I select, and then click OK. And now, even if I do insert a column, it will not move around. My button's pretty much fixed where it's at. And I don't name the button yet. I click on it, and I click Control-C, and then I paste the button. And so this gives me a sort of uniformity to each of my buttons. And by clicking a cell sort of below it, you can see how I'm selecting a cell in a sort of uniform fashion that's like kind of like below and to the left, and then I'm pasting the buttons in. And I could select 3 buttons, and then I could paste them in here. I could, you're going to want to write this down probably, but I could do Control, Shift, click. Oops, Control, Shift, A gets me all of them. So remember, Control Shift A will allow you to select all the buttons. So if I do Control click, Control Shift A, that gets me all the buttons. So something I kind of glossed over here is that if I click on a button, it immediately tries to run the button. And the reason why I said to do Control click to select the button is that prevents the button from executing when you select it. You also have the option at any point to go up to the Developer tab and switch this to Design mode. It's a little bit different depending on your sort of macro settings. Right now it's grayed out, but if I was to, let's go ahead and save this as I'm going to save it on my desktop. Let's browse. I realized that I want to save this file really quick and save it as a .xlsm. Oops, I just screwed up my name. So don't do what I just did, which is that I saved it as a .xlsx with .xlsm as the extension written into the file name. So when you're saving a workbook, delete the extension out of the name so that you don't end up with this sort of funky thing going on. Yeah, that's a good example to kind of like go over that really quick. So for some reason, design mode's not popping up here as an option. I'll have to look into that later, but design mode gives you the ability to toggle this on or off. And design mode being on, it allows you to just click on the buttons. I have a new version of Excel installed, but I will do a follow-up video to explain how to access design mode. So that means that as I click any of the buttons, it will just select it like with the control click as opposed to clicking and trying to execute a macro. Okay, so next is if I was to do control click, control shift A, what's the purpose of selecting all of my buttons? Well, if I wanted to format them all at the same time, then I would go to font, maybe I want to do bold, and then I want to do a blue button font. I'm going to make it a little bit bigger font, and let's do agency FB. So now my buttons say button 2. And this is kind of a standard button. If I wanted to, I could go and then just insert any shape. And I'm going to show you the difference between a shape and a traditional button. So this is very popular. I know people like to do this where they give the shape an effect, like a bevel, you know, for example. Maybe it looks really cool. And let's do a shape fill. So we give the shape a couple colors. And an outline, so a slightly darker blue. I don't know why the bevel's not looking very interesting there. Let's do that. Okay, so this is looking like a little bit more of a modern shape. And feel free to rewind that, watch it slowly, see what the options are, but you can play around with it. It looks really cool. I've started using this a little bit more, but keep in mind that it's, in some ways on older versions of Excel, not as easy to work with. So like say for example, if I wanted to paste these, and I control click on all of these, and then I go to Format Object. In older versions of Excel, it's difficult to select all of them and access all of the menu options. In newer versions of Excel, it's a lot easier to go through all of these menus. But if you look at this, and I go to Size and Properties, right? That's going to give me the option to lock the aspect ratio. If I go to here and then properties, it says the same things that I had with the buttons here. So if I was to select all of these and then right click and go to size and properties, I can do the exact same thing I did on the other buttons where I do move and size of cells. No, I don't want to do that. I don't want to move or size. Let's click on this option and we'll be safe going forward. So this looks nice and fancy, works a little bit better in current versions of Excel. I don't have both installed on this computer, so if you're struggling, revert back to the developer tab, go to here, just insert a basic button, and you can work with these. If you're in a newer version of Excel, go to insert, go to shapes, and start designing your own buttons if you want to do something a little bit cooler. Older versions work great too. So next I want to go over some basic table constructs that I would recommend for a new user. And this is where you're going to set up user entry tables. And the reason why this is a little bit tricky, so I'll usually call this like setup tab or something, right? And maybe this is table 1, and it represents all the file paths that go into your macro. And this is a bunch of file paths that somebody's opening. And so this is the file name reference. You know, maybe this is like somebody saying, this is where I get phone numbers, and then phone numbers is located at a specific location, right? And maybe it's / my phone numbers / you know, like there's a folder here. You get the point. So you end up entering in a bunch of user entries here, and maybe it's data that you're going to interact with. And then somebody says, I want to also put in a table here, and I'm going to have this be user profile information. So username, login ID, and maybe this is their personal phone number, all kinds of whatever personal identifying data. So probably line up my headers. Now, there's two things that you want to keep in mind here. If you're writing a macro and you're going to do any kind of explicit referencing, and you're going to specifically refer to the phone numbers as existing in column G, and then the file paths as existing in column B, I can't later say, oh, I want to add a bunch of information here. I want to put the password for the file. I want to put the file type. You know, maybe I want to say like Excel or text file. You know, like maybe this is like a yes or no. Maybe I want to have do I want to run this file? So, and then this is going to say text, and this is going to say password here, and then run file says yes. And so I've created this sort of like interactive table where some settings are getting passed into my macro, and then I say, uh-oh, phone number got moved way over there. And phone number used to be all the way over here in column G, if I remember correctly. And I've edited my macro so that now if I've written some code somewhere and I've changed the references that are associated with actual locations in my workbook. So there's two workarounds here. There's two ways you can approach this. One is you can never do any explicit referencing, which is a little bit of a challenge, and it requires you to have a good grasp of how to work with named ranges. Or you could just say from the get-go, I'm going to give myself a bunch of hidden columns that exist at the end of each table. So I'm going to say that this is an unused column. And maybe I'm going to give myself 4 of them to work with as a precautionary measure, and then I'm going to hide them so that nobody can actually see them. And then the user could populate this table and then tell you as a developer, hey, I'd like to add a column here. And you can say, sure, no problem. I happen to have created some space that I can work with. And the same is true at the end of this table if I was to continue to have more tables next to each other. Now be careful when you're putting tables next to each other because it's very ugly when it comes to something like filtering data. So it's really meant for like these kind of setup tabs where somebody's entering in some basic information on how to run your macro. Now, if you wanted to use named ranges, I could obviously call this phone number. I have to do a valid reference, which means that I can't have a space in the name of the named range. So I'm going to do phone_number. And now, no matter how many times I insert a column, I can always tell the macro, go to the range called phone number. And if you want to know how to do that and reference the code that way, then you're going to want to watch my video about named ranges. So that's a basic introduction on how to set up your macro and do some really just easy stuff for a user interface. And lastly, let's just go over how to assign a macro. So if I had a procedure, I'm going to go into my editor. I'm going to insert a module, and we're going to do a test procedure. And we'll just do a message box that says test. Now, if you go back and you click on assign macro and you click on test procedure, you'll automatically see every open workbook here, which can be completely overwhelming. And so you're probably going to want to change this to say this workbook. And then it'll only show you macro procedures that exist in this workbook. Click on that. And now when I click on this button, it'll say test. If I click on any of the other buttons, I'm going to get that ugly warning that says that nothing's been assigned to this button. I may go ahead and delete some of these because it looks awful, but I'm going to leave these here that you can then use these. And I guess the last little tidbit of information is I like to think of these buttons as reading kind of like a book would. And if I was to have two things that, you know, maybe they're associated, it would be, I would edit the text and I would call this maybe procedure 1, and then maybe I'm going to call this archive procedure 1. And maybe after I do procedure 1, this button archives a copy of the tab data output into a folder location somewhere, for example. That would just be an example. And then here I would have, say, procedure 2, and if procedure 2 doesn't need to be archived, I wouldn't put a button there. So I usually kind of think of these things as being related. I can then move these down. I can create spaces between things. I also, a lot of times, like to have a button that kind of sets up the macro for a new day, because I have processes where they run multiple times throughout the day, but then I need the user to distinguish that a new day has begun. It's the first time I'm running it for that day, and to clear out all pre-existing information. So I'll call this start new day. And that resets the macro. Maybe you want to put something that says, are you sure you want to start a new day? And well, now we're going to clear out your entire macro. And I would do that kind of like this. So we'll just give you a little bonus information here. And we'll say user input equals message box. Are you sure this will clear all prior day information? And we're going to use the VB yes no prompt. And then if user input, well, let's see, what does user input come up as if I put yes? If I put are you sure yes, then it's going to be a 6. And I got that because I hovered my mouse over it and I can see the number 6. So now I'm going to say if user input equals 6, then we're going to clear data. And maybe you write some code that goes through each tab, it clears out old information, and then you're going to do a message box that says old data cleared, else message box nothing was done, and then an end if. And again, you'll notice I'm being really terribly lazy about case sensitivity here, which is a bad habit I have from working with Visual Basic. Please don't make those bad habits, because it will be hard for you to switch languages to something else like Python. And again, I'm going to turn on option explicit here, which will then require me to define my variables. So user input is a long type variable. Dim user input as long, which means it's a whole positive or negative number. And nothing else is really a variable assignment here, so this is fine. And it says, are you sure this will clear prior day information? And then I'll say yes, and then old data cleared is my next message, and then we'll get to the end sub. And again, this is the only thing I actually assigned. I'm not going to populate everything here, but this gives you a good example of kind of how this information looks when you're setting up a new macro. Again, I would format everything to look a lot better, and I'll try to upload some macros later that show a completely fleshed out user interface, but these are some great starting tips and points. All right, thanks for joining, and I hope to see you in the next video.